So I'm going to invite Seema to go ahead and start with your introduction of how and why the program started and types of cases you take and all that kind of good context stuff. So.
Great, thank you so much. It's great to hear all of your joyful moments. I feel like I know you a little bit now. So I thought maybe I would start, as Leanne suggested, talking about how I landed where I am. I started out, I went to law school, and after law school, I went to the Public Defender Service in Washington, D.C. There I practiced representing folks for 6 or 7 years, and then I went to work at a foundation located in Washington, D.C., working on criminal and juvenile justice reform, and I was there for 8 years. And when I was there, one of the kind of big portfolios that I started in my program was one around prosecutorial change, prosecutorial culture change. And so when in DC, a gentleman named Karl Racine was running for office to be the first elected attorney general. And I knew not him directly, but I knew folks who knew him because he also spent some time in his prior legal career at the Public Defender Service. And I heard him speak about his interest in being the attorney general, but also his real kind of commitment to juvenile justice reform and criminal justice reform. I thought this would be a great opportunity to see if I could, see if I could learn more about prosecutorial culture and what that's about, and also like how, if possible, you could shift culture at an office among prosecutors. I guess just as a little context, in Washington, D.C., the Attorney General's office has jurisdiction over all juvenile prosecution. So we are the juvenile prosecutor for all D.C. crime. We have some jurisdiction over adult prosecution, but it's just a sliver of it. It's low-level kind of municipal and traffic offenses. In D.C., our adult prosecutor is the federal government, the U.S. Attorney's Office, so we don't have jurisdiction over adult cases. Hence why Attorney General Racine was really focused on juvenile justice when he came into office. I had heard, when I had first started working on prosecution culture change at the foundation, I had talked to a friend who is also a funder who had worked in San Francisco for the then district attorney of San Francisco, Kamala Harris. And he was kind of her number one or number two kind of policy person. And he'd been there for many years. He had been with her for many years. And he said, you know, when we came into office, we hired really good people. We hired folks who were civil rights minded. We trained them well on Brady and on racial disparities in the justice system and all these things. And he said, but what we would notice is that over time, they would become more punitive. And we didn't really know, you know, all of the training that we did didn't really reverse that trend. And that really like stuck with me. And that was something I was really interested in exploring at the new office. And so when I came to OAG, they had me work among the juvenile prosecutors because, you know, I really wanted to get to know them. I wanted to see about the work that they did. And I wanted to see if we could kind of change, like, could we like bend that, you know, like that culture away from like punitiveness. And what I learned is that over time, because, you know, I've now been there for 5 years, but shortly after the Attorney General came into office, there were folks who left, folks who were asked to leave, and there were a lot of openings. So we got to hire new prosecutors, and we too hired folks who came from the advocacy world. We hired folks who had themselves worked with young people before and had the kind of philosophical, ideological leanings that we kind of felt fit with the Attorney General. And and I also got to be friends with these prosecutors, right? They became the folks I like hung out with in the office, and we'd chit chat at the water cooler, that kind of stuff that we all remember fondly. Now, and what I saw was, even with some of the folks who we hired, there is this institutional thing that happens in the prosecutor's office that makes it very hard for folks to hold on to that. And I ended up, actually, I wrote a law review article, which nobody has read beside, not even my mom has read this, and very few people will probably read it, but I talk about the fact that I think like there are several things that happen to prosecutors. One of them is that there's like a confirmation bias, right? Prosecutors only see failure. And I saw that. I had friends and colleagues who, I remember one of our colleagues sent a case to my program, to the Restorative Justice Program, and then got a little bit more information about the youth. There's some allegation that maybe the youth was getting involved. And then she came back to one of our facilitators and said, I'm just really not sure if I want to send this to you. And our facilitator went and sat with her and said, well, what's going on? What's in your mind? Why are you thinking that? And she goes, the truth is, like, in the last 2 weeks, 3 youth that I have prosecuted, but offered lenient whatever, have come back and committed, it seems they've come back onto my caseload with more serious offenses. And I thought that was really fascinating because it was chilling her behavior. But what she didn't see is that maybe there were 30 youth who touched the system and bounced off it and succeeded, and she would never know that because there's no kind of feedback loop of success for prosecutors. There's also the case that prosecutors are not allowed to ever speak to people who they are prosecuting, at least in DC, and I think most places it's really frowned upon. Like, we even tried, as one of our efforts to change culture, we tried to encourage our prosecutors to speak directly to the young people in court, to validate them for things that they had done well, say nice things to them, even in court, in a setting where everything is recorded and above ground. And the judges yelled at them. That's not your place. That's not your job. Like, get back to your work, kind of thing. And so there is this natural problem that it is easy to dehumanize people that you're not allowed to have any contact with. And the third thing that I noticed pretty palpably is that over time, defense attorneys and prosecutors, they came to really distrust each other. And because of their different roles, because I think defense attorneys are, institutionally and ethically obligated to zealously advocate for their client. And that could mean manipulating the rules, in whatever way they are legally allowed to. In order to get the best situation, whereas prosecutors see that as playing games. And so over time, like, the relationship deteriorates, not all defense attorneys and prosecutors, but many. And what I would see is like folklore in the office about like the worst thing that the defense attorney recently said, and everybody would hear about it. And then what happens is the prosecutors can't help but kind of project onto the person represented their feelings for the person representing, especially if you're already dehumanizing that person, because you don't get to have really any direct contact with them or typically their families. And so I thought restorative justice, we tried a bunch of different things. We tried trainings, we tried to reduce proximity between prosecutors and the communities that were prosecuted. We did a bunch of stuff. We didn't really see any appreciable change in behavior. Maybe, I just didn't see changes in how prosecutors did their work. And so I happened upon restorative justice and brought it to the office. And what I thought would be valuable about having restorative justice in the office and available for prosecutors is 2 things. One, that prosecutors would directly have to deal with restorative justice. There are other programs around the country where there are outside nonprofits that do the restorative justice, and there's kind of a gatekeeper at the prosecutor's office, and they send appropriate cases. But the line prosecutors don't ever have to like negotiate with restorative justice. And I really wanted them to have to deal with it. I wanted them to look at crime and conflict in a different way. I wanted them to see that they have different tools and to utilize those tools. And most importantly, I really wanted them to have different conversations with victims. I believed, based on what I'd done in my previous job, that when they asked different questions of victims, when they had different interactions with victims, what they might find was that not all victims wanted everyone buried under the jail. And that if given options, they would find that victims oftentimes needed and wanted more or different things than what prosecution and the justice system could offer. And so that is why it was important to me to bring restorative justice into the office, to have the prosecutors grapple with it. What ended up happening was that by hiring restorative justice facilitators to work alongside prosecutors, one of the other things that was a really great kind of unintended consequence is that the prosecutors were exposed to folks who came from totally different backgrounds, had different experiences, and grew to trust them and really like kind of love them. I think our facilitators are loved more than others in our office. They're really great. And our facilitators, come from the communities where people are highly criminalized, who experience violence at a higher rate, experience criminalization at a higher rate than others. And so that was one really like a really important thing, because what we also had to do was build trust with prosecutors and get prosecutors to believe in restorative justice. What I didn't want to do also was to force them to do it. I didn't want it to be something that they did grudgingly, because I didn't think that would work, that we needed line prosecutors to want to send cases to us. And that all worked pretty well. But I think that what was the most impactful thing that we ended up doing, and I was terrified of doing this, but one of my facilitators said, okay, now's the time, like take a deep breath, is we invited one by one prosecutors to sit in on restorative justice conferences and observe them. And that's when we really started to see a change in how prosecutors saw their work and their appreciation for restorative justice. And of course, we make sure that the prosecutor who's invited to sit in on the conference is not at all affiliated with the case and then is firewalled from the case, is conflicted out. And they don't act as prosecutors. We have them come and sit in as participants. And they get to observe, but they also have to participate in all parts of the restorative justice conference. And what we found is, after we put a prosecutor in the conference, and I was so nervous about doing this, so I picked like my favorite prosecutor, like my best friend prosecutor. And what we found with her, and then what we found again and again with almost all of our prosecutors, is after we had a prosecutor sit in on a restorative justice conference, they were more likely to send us more cases, and they would be likely to send us more serious cases. And over time, what we've seen is that prosecutors have told us that they talk to their victims differently. They ask their victims things like, what does justice look like to you? What do you need? How do you feel? And they have talked to them, and one of the prosecutors was telling me, like, it didn't make sense to ask those questions before because they didn't have things to offer. And it would be almost more hurtful when all you've got is prosecution or no prosecution to say, like, what do you need, is not like a fruitful conversation. And it's actually kind of depressing, because even if somebody says, I'm scared to walk in the world with somebody who's hurt me and think that I might have contact with them, the prosecutor can say, I can get you a stay away order, but that will expire at the end of the case. And so even that is not as satisfying as it might originally seem. We had a prosecutor who was very law and order type prosecutor, and she sat in on a restorative justice conference where a young man, this was actually a young adult, had broken through somebody's car window and stolen a tablet out of his car. And he himself was, a person who had, lived with like very little cushion, right? He was an immigrant himself. He sold oils on the streets. He was kind of holding down a couple of different jobs, just trying to make his way in the world. And when he started preparing with our restorative justice facilitator, he said, look, I need money for this tablet that I lost. Like my boss charged me for it. I didn't have the money at the time. This was really a hardship for me. And the facilitator was like, great, that's what you can ask for. He was also really wanted to do restorative justice because he was really scared that the person who did this to him had targeted him and his car was parked nearby his house, and he was really worried that the person who did this had been he knew where he lived, he'd been watching him, that he might hurt him again, that he might do this again. He was worried about all of those things. And so when he got into the restorative justice conference, it turns out that the young man who did this to him came with his girlfriend, and he explained that he had been homeless for several days before and really hadn't eaten a lot. And he was at like kind of a pretty desperate point when he did this. He and his girlfriend talked about the fact that in the couple of months subsequent, he had kind of gotten things together. He was now taking classes for a job training program. And we had this prosecutor sit in, she knew nothing about the case. And at the agreement part of the conference, they'd all shared a lot. We do a lot of community building where they talk about their own past challenges and that kind of stuff. So folks had been emotional, people crying, like all of that. And it got around to the point where you ask, what do you want to make this right so that it won't ever happen again? And the gentleman who had been harmed said, I know it's going to be really tough once you finish this job training program for you to, I want you to make sure that you go to 5 interviews, because I know the feeling of right before the interview having like a confidence crisis and not wanting to go, but I need you to go. And so I want you to go to 5 interviews, and I want you to show me that you went to 5 interviews to show me proof that you did. And they were like, all right, we'll do that. And the facilitator, apparently, I wasn't in the conference, the prosecutor told me, the facilitator was like, anything else that you want? And he was like, no, that's all. And then it went around, and they were like, are you sure there's nothing else that you want? And he was like, nope, that's all I want. And it went around to the young man, and he said, look, if I get a job and I have a paycheck, I'll try and pay you back. It'll probably take me a little while, but I want to try and pay you back for the thing that I took. And he was like, nope, I don't want that. And what the prosecutor told me after was, she was like, it occurred to me at that moment that what was empowering about the restorative justice conference for that person who had been harmed, that victim of the crime, was he was given the power to show grace and generosity. And that was what he needed to heal and to feel that this was now something behind him, and to feel better. And she said after that it changed. She said, I was always that prosecutor who was like, the one thing I can get for people is restitution. Like, I can't do much, I know, in this system, but one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to ask for an order of restitution in every case. And now she was like, I really rethink that, because I wonder if I really know best what somebody needs when they've been harmed. And that, I thought, was really powerful lesson for her to have taken from that experience. And then, she sends us basically every case as restitution. We have we have prosecutors who send us every case where the people who got in the conflict with each other knew each other or came from the same community. Because she knows that you can prosecute somebody fully, and they can take a plea, they can, be put on probation, they can go through the whole shebang, and they can go back to the community, and the problem that resulted in the conflict will never have been addressed. And in fact, it might be worse. And she knows that same thing that we all know, and that is that people who've been harmed walk around every day and are nervous and are fearful. And it's really important for them to be able to resolve that, to be able to address the conflict. So I wanted to say all that because that's my usual shtick. I usually don't go into stories, so sorry for going on and on, but I wanted to say that that's how I came to the work, and that's why I thought it was really important for the work to be done in our office, and we've had success with it. But I should also say that the restorative justice community in the States is very concerned about the idea of putting a restorative justice program in a prosecutor's office. And Leanne, who's been working on restorative justice for a long time, has found me and talked to me about this many times. And I give you credit, Leanne, because it's forced me to really grapple with it. And I have to say, that it is a point of real vulnerability for me, because I'm not sure if what we've done is the right thing. I see danger in putting restorative justice in a prosecutor's office, and I'm not sure if in the greater scheme of things, if that's the right thing. What some critics would say is that there's danger that the process and the program can be co-opted by the system. There's certainly the danger that prosecutors with the best intentions will just want to add restorative justice on to every other condition that they already use. There's a huge danger of net widening, which happens with many, many other programs. And what I find sometimes is that I do get calls from other prosecutors' offices around the country, and after having conversations with folks in those offices, I find myself at the end of the conversations thinking, and sometimes saying, please don't do this. Because I think it's really hard to be vigilant about the things that are potentially dangerous with putting this in a system. And over time, as I've done this more and more, what's become very clear to me is that I personally have come to really strongly believe that the adversarial process itself is very broken, that our system is broken, and the process of fighting as adversaries over cases, as defense attorneys and prosecutors, to resolve conflict is a terrible way to do so. I think that where somebody wants to exercise their constitutional right to go to trial or test the government's evidence, that's different. That is what trial and the court system was prepared for. That's why we have all these procedural protections that keeps, the defendant or respondent from having to make statements, and has the defense attorney say everything for them, and doesn't let the victim take part in any of those processes. But the truth is that 95% of cases end in pleas. And the plea process is terrible for resolution of conflict. And all those procedural things that are created for trial and protection of rights of an accused who has a right to go to trial, they actually work terribly where somebody is willing to take responsibility for their actions. Because when you do take a plea in court, nobody believes that it's sincere. And so it doesn't give the person who was harmed very much there. Nobody expects or even creates an opportunity for the person really to apologize for what they've done. The person who's been harmed has very little opportunity to speak authentically about what has happened to them, and have very little say in what needs to be done to make it right. And so what I've kind of come to make myself feel better about having this program in a prosecutor's office is that my job and our job in DC is to show folks that it is possible to transform a system to being a restorative system. And that's what we're aiming for in DC. It's one of the benefits of being in the office and working, having the program be in the office, is we can take now whatever cases we want. And in order to answer one of your questions, Bob, we are moving towards taking only serious and violent crime, short of homicides, and evaluating that, and not leaving it to the discretion of prosecutors to tell us which cases they think are worthy of restorative justice, or this off-ramp from the juvenile justice system that would allow for a dismissal of the case. We are going to take them randomly and evaluate the success with those cases. And if we can move to taking more and more of the market share, if we can start to actually hire more facilitators and fewer prosecutors, and try to rebalance the system so that, when young people want to go to trial, they can do that, and we'll have prosecutors to handle those trials. But where somebody is willing to take a plea, where a victim is interested in doing restorative justice, that option is always the default and the first option. And then to show that the sky doesn't fall when you do that, that this is a possibility, and then hope for other offices to use that knowledge, and hopefully an evaluation that kind of proves that out with data, to innovate in their own ways, and possibly ways that keeps restorative justice closer to communities and in the communities and farther from the justice system, but allows them to get the really hard cases, and allows them to have restorative justice be the default first option before prosecution and penetration into the justice system. That's my hope and dream. See if I had anything else to say. I'll tick through our statistics just because that might be helpful. We have 6 full-time restorative justice facilitators who work with me and their supervisor. We have another one who's coming on board in the new fiscal year in October. We've handled over 140 restorative justice conferences. Of those, only 7 have been returned to prosecutors for prosecution because a young person didn't comply with the terms of their agreement or the group didn't come to an agreement. We have very high rates of victim satisfaction. We do surveys right after the conference, and then we do 6 months later a call by an independent person, and they use a victim satisfaction survey, and we have 90% of victims say that they would do restorative justice again and recommend it to a friend, and that they were satisfied with the process. And with our early cases, we took a chunk of time and a chunk of cases and compared them to a similar set, and we saw reduced recidivism rates of about 15%. That was like kind of an internal recidivism analysis. And we hope to launch a randomized control trial that we're supposed to launch in April soon. And that will be for only our serious violent crime, which we've started ticking already. So that was a lot. I'm sorry to go on and on. I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so I think the point was for you to go on and on. Yeah, so I just want to, Bob has a question up here, and then yeah, because you kind of covered a lot of what I had here as initial questions, but I think there's some more we can take on. But yeah, so Bob wanted to know what kind of training your circle keepers have and get. Great.
Yes. I thought it was really important. I was really interested in the idea of like, can you scale restorative justice? Can you implement it? Can you operationalize it in the system? And can you scale it? And so I, on purpose, hired folks who had no restorative justice experience, but had potentially been justice involved themselves, worked with young people in the past, that kind of thing. And then what we did was we basically all trained together, and we trained in various different styles of restorative justice, and then kind of came up with our own model. The restorative justice conferencing model is the one that we decided to use because it has a little bit more of kind of a structure to it, and it is meant to deal with conflict. And there are 3 basic questions that are asked. What happened? How is everyone impacted? And then what needs to happen to make it right? But we also went through kind of a 5 to 7 day, all day, every day, like circle keeping training with some local restorative justice practitioners who had been doing circles for years and years and years. And we really benefited from that. And one thing that we took from that was we added to the 3 questions a portion at the beginning called what we call community building. And that is about building vulnerability and seeing each other as humans. And so we're usually dealing with young people who are accused of crime. So we start with a strengths-based question. And then we basically, what we're trying to do is try to do like quick bonding between people, because we're about to have a conversation, which is a scary one, and one that's tough, right? Somebody hurt somebody else. And so we need people to start out recognizing that everyone is like vulnerable, and everyone can show compassion, and everyone is like, a human being that's been hurt before. So like one of our clutch questions, although we actually moot, we go through and practice every restorative justice conference that anybody is going to do. We all do it as a team first. So we moot every case together. And what we do is we talk about what the goals of the conference are. And then the facilitator will kind of make sure their community building questions link up with the goals of the conference. But one of the kind of clutch questions that people often ask, and this is one that I was asked in an early circle that I was put in, was talk about a challenge in your life that you have overcome that has made you stronger. And it seems like a simple question, but I swear, if we ask that question with the 15, 20 of us, you would find sometimes really, really tough stuff coming up. And it's just amazing. I always wonder at how it happens, but I think what happens is like pain and hurt and trauma sometimes lives close to us. And when we're, close to like our surface, and when we're given a moment to have to really reflect and think about like, what's something that was really hard that I went through? It's easy to access it somehow. Maybe it's pain from today or recent, or maybe it's pain from like the past or pain from a relationship, but man, people sometimes say things that are shockingly personal and traumatic and emotional. And sometimes what we do as a facilitator, what the facilitator will do is to kind of think through all of the people who are going to be in the conference and think about the person who is most likely, like kind of the most verbal person or the most likely to share, and have that person start the circle. And once somebody starts saying something that's really personal, then other people really move into that space. And, it's just like so often that there are tears and like really, and then what happens is everyone loves each other a little bit, right? Because you've been vulnerable and shared something very personal, and somebody has given you the honor of hearing something really hurt, something that has hurt you too. And when you've done that, you like form this bond. And it's really hard to have formed that kind of bond and humanity and that connection. And then even when you're talking about something that was really hard, that really pissed you off and that hurt you, to be really mean about it. Like it makes it so that you can have a conversation about something even that's really tough, and see the other person as a human being and see them as more than what they did to you. And that's like a really beautiful thing about restorative justice. So we learned from the different trainings, and we kind of pieced together what we thought was going to work for us, and we've kind of tweaked it over time. It's basically the same. It's basically the same 3 questions. We added on community building. We added on a part at the end called what we call the redemption. I don't know why we call it that phase, and that's really for the young person to vision, like, okay, assume that you did all of the stuff in this agreement. You were successful. You continued on with your school, and you graduated, and and you've done really well. Like you've done the best that you can imagine. And let's think about what your life will look like 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 years out. Talk about what your hopes and dreams are for you at that point. And then you have the young person kind of vision themselves in a positive light, and everyone around them goes through this, because every question in the circle gets asked to everyone. And then you can have a conversation about, well, what do you need to do to get there? And so that's a really nice way for everyone at the end to kind of put into words and vocalize a plan for building capacity to move along in a positive way. So that's how we do our work. And we've been through a ton of training, but the truth is that the real training comes from doing it, observing it, and co-facilitating cases. So we've got a new facilitator who started, and he's now sat in and observed on virtual conferences, 4 restorative justice conferences. He's been through our whole training, and he will now be able to start co-facilitating cases. We'll have him co-facilitate 3 cases before he can be a lead on a case. And that's really where the learning comes in, doing it, because we all get better over time. I always say that there is no facilitator, the most expert restorative justice facilitator, who is better than all of our brains together, working out a case together. And that's the truth.
Oh, great. Thank you. I'm looking at the time and thinking that it might make sense for us to do a quick question round. And that way kind of catch up the questions. I think what might be helpful is if you have a question, say the question, not have Seema answer until we've kind of gone around and collected them up, because there may be some common themes, or you hear somebody's question and you want to tag on to it or whatever. So I am, and also feel free to pass if you don't have a question or somebody's already asked your question. And if for whatever reason you feel like you'd rather just put your question in the chat box, feel free to do that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and skip Seema, because you may have a question of yourself, but let's see what question Candace might have. So I will pass to you with resilience.
Thank you. So my question would be, how are you all dealing with cases that involve interpersonal violence, such as sexual assault, sexual harassment, dating violence for juveniles, maybe the successes and some of the challenges? And I'll pass with Autumn, or pass with, with trust to Autumn.
Thanks, Candace. I know you said that once the prosecutors participated in the circles, they pretty much got on board, but I'd like to know a little bit more about, I guess, the process of it's the whole RJ program starting, and how long that took to get everyone on board, and not at the point when you guys were doing the circles, but just what went into getting everyone on board and how long that took, and what that involved. And I will pass with open-mindedness to Nasha.
Thank you, Seema. Wow, that's amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your experience. I learned a lot. I have a lot of questions, but I mean, the first question I guess that I'm wrestling with when it comes to the system change, you mentioned that, the system is broken, and, but also applying restorative justice is dangerous with the prosecutor. So I just wanna, if you can elaborate more about how much you can change the system within, because you're doing that work with the facilitator and all that stuff, how much power you can make in order to make changing in the policies and make reform. Is that easy? How that will look like? I mean, that big question, I know, but I'm curious. And thank you. I will pass with hope to Damon.
Well, thanks for your presentation. I appreciate that. I'm new to restorative justice. I've actually, thank you for highlighting some of the dangers that it can bring to implementing it into the prosecutor's office. I've actually think that we've experienced some of that already here in Arlington County. And I pass to Lauren.
Thanks. My question was more about funding, and you talked about you have 6 facilitators, and then obviously yourself. So whether we put it in our prosecutor's office or wherever we put it, we're going to need to hopefully pay people to help us. So that was more of my question: grants, or where the funding is coming from and who's supporting that. And with gratitude, I will pass to Mustafa.
Thank you, Seema, for your presentation. I don't have a question at the moment. And I pass with humility to Katie.
My question, of course, is about funding as well, but I'm also, I guess the other pieces about that is I was kind of thinking you were with the prosecutor's office when you first started talking, and then not. So I'm kind of wondering where you're connected, and then also in terms of funding, I'm wondering for things like transportation and needs that might come up for people participating. Do you have a budget for that? Yeah, those are my questions. Oh, and I pass with appreciation to Bob.
Thank you, Katie. I asked 2 questions in the chat and you've answered both of them, so I'll pass to Jen with energy.
Thank you, Seema, for your presentation. My questions were, what role, if any, do officers have in your current system? Do they participate in the restorative justice meetings or conferences in any way? If, for instance, an officer responded out in that situation? And then my other question is, have you had any cases that related to animals, specifically animal violence in relation to minors, and have you used RJ processes? Thank you. And I pass with care to Devanshi.
Hey, Seema. I will align my question with Lauren's question on funding. The other question I guess I have is the quantifiable and qualitative data analysis and reporting on not just recidivism, but other reporting that you guys are doing to maybe justify the funding or to continue programming. If you could talk about that, please. And I pass to Amelia.
Similarly to Devanshi and Lauren, and first, thank you for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it. You know, you have sort of talked about your program being unique in that it is in a prosecutor's office. And I wondered kind of how that works in terms of the facilitators, right? So it sounds like you have facilitators who are located within your office. And I wonder if you could talk about kind of the contrast to, you know, facilitators being out in the community, whether that would be something that could be run by your office or by like a third-party organization, kind of some of the differences that introduces. And I will pass with humility to Maren.
Seema, thank you so much for the presentation. I definitely learned a lot. My question is about if you've seen any patterns in terms of the types of cases that seem to work well with the RJ process and maybe some that don't. I think you talked about a recidivism rate being, I think you said 15% lower. And then you talked about victim satisfaction being about 90%. I don't know if there's any like correlation between cases where there's more likely to be recidivism or there's less likely to be victim satisfaction. And then you also mentioned the cases that have broken agreements, like where they don't comply, although that seemed like a very low number. So I don't know if there's any statistics there. But I'd be really curious to know if there were some cases that you kind of have a red flag on now, or some that you think like RJ almost always works in those types of cases. And I will pass to Parissa.
I think there's a little confusion about what you meant by danger, Seema, and I would like you to please explain what you meant by danger. Is it danger to the community? Is it danger to the adversarial process? I would like to know exactly what you meant by that, please. And I also would like to know how, when you do talk to other offices, prosecutor offices, and you're talking through how to, like what to set up and how to create the programs and whether it should be in or outside of the office. Like, what are the factors that people are considering and that you're talking to them about? Sort of like, what are the decision trees, or like, you know, sort of, like, I almost don't even know what criteria to use. And so I think we would all benefit by sort of hearing what criteria others have used. Oh, and I'm sorry, I passed to Michael with patients.
Thanks, Parissa. Maren and Parissa actually asked my questions. My question is more specific to the 15%. I just wonder if we could maybe discuss how that compares to the punitive system. Is that you know, a better rate or a worse rate? And then more specifically with the 7 cases that didn't work, I know you said they didn't agree to fulfill their end of the conference, but I just am curious to know if there were maybe barriers that prevented them. And I will pass with curiosity to Lucretia.
My questions were pretty much already asked, so I'm going to pass with hope to Leanne.
All right, great. I actually have a couple questions to tack on as well. And the first one is something that came up, I think, in our conversation and in our last meeting, which has to do with a person coming into the process, admitting culpability on some level. And there was a question about like, wow, how does that happen? And you know, protections and defense attorneys and how all that kind of works. So maybe if you could say, I mean, this is a very weedsy kind of question, but like how a case comes in, what happens. I thought I heard you say something about a plea process involved in this. And so I wasn't sure if this is pre-charge, like exactly where does this fit in, and how did you all figure out how to, you know, make it fit in a way that works, that's not you know, adding to people's to the possibility of them getting in worse trouble or something like that. So yeah. So do you want to just, I see you've been taking notes. You want to just sort of go for it and see what you can answer in the time we have? Oh, you're muted. Sorry.
No, my fault. Thank you. Do you have a certain amount of time you want me to take, or when should I just stop talking?
So we'll go until 8 for when we kind of want to take a break. If there's a lot more and you're willing to stay a little bit more, I suspect that the group would like to have their questions answered. So I think we could spill over after we come back from the break, if you're willing to stay, and there's a lot more after, you know, we get to 8 o'clock. Does that sound good?
Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, I'm thinking that what I might do is talk a little bit, Leanne, to get to your question about like the mechanics of how our system works. Then go into how we started that system and the budget question that a lot of you have asked, because that's a part of starting up a program. I'll touch on really quickly the statistics and metrics that we use, Devanshi and Michael and a couple others mentioned, and Marin, I think, and then I'll hopefully try and be a little bit more clear about a space that I'm a little conflicted myself, which is the risks of having a program in-house and what alternatives may look like, and how I talk to other offices about that. So I have all the questions written down. I might have time after going through these kind of big buckets to go through the more detailed ones. But let me try to start there. First, I'll say, Leanne, that what we did when I first started the program, I didn't have any staff. It was just me. And I was taking a couple of cases. Obviously, my capacity was limited. I had some outside restorative justice trainers do a training for me, and I asked for any volunteers from the office and got a couple of people to volunteer, and they helped me, and we took a handful of cases. And in the beginning, I just wanted to see if we could kind of cut our teeth and take some cases. Like I said, it was really important to me as a culture change matter to not force prosecutors to send us cases. I think this might get to one of the questions that was asked about Naja, about systems change. I thought it would be better if folks grew to build support and trust with the restorative justice process, and therefore send us cases out of their own volition, as opposed to having been forced to do so. And so we kind of just like said we were kind of open for business. It's a little bit more complicated. We started actually taking some cases that were going to be prosecuted that originated in schools and tried to keep them from coming to our office. But essentially what we did for the prosecutors, we said, like, we can take some cases. I talked a lot about restorative justice. I talked about what I had learned. And I said, does anybody have any interesting cases? And I, would kind of go around, and there's just me. So like I could only handle a few cases. And what I found, and what I think you'll find with prosecutors generally, is there are many cases that even like the hardest, most punitive prosecutors, there are cases where they'll be like, yeah, I don't know if this really merits like the full prosecution. And so there are these cases on the edge that feel like they don't fit properly within the kind of criminal justice prosecution system. And so those are the kind of cases I got first, right? There are cases that were anomalous, like a really, really good kid made a bad decision, or a victim really wanting to talk to the kid and having a lot of questions or something like that. And so we got a couple of cases that way, just to start to like see if we could do it and build some demand for the services. And then, you know, all the while I was thinking about how to fund the program and to get more positions. I, like you all, was really lucky to have an incredibly kind of radical and progressive and reform-minded leader. And so that, I think, is an absolute prerequisite to having a program in your office. And that's why I think that there is potential for you all to do that. Because there has to be so much vigilance about making sure that the program is protected and the young people who are accused of crime or the defendants are protected and the process is kind of done in the right way. When a new case comes to, and so in that context, what would happen was we would take like the prosecutors would send us pretty low level cases, low risk young people who were charged with the offense, and it would be in the context of the justice process. And so it might be that the young person will be given a deferred prosecution agreement, which basically says, okay, we're going to hold off on prosecuting you. But if you go through with this restorative justice process and it's successful and you come to agreement and then you comply with all of the terms of your agreement, at the end of that, we'll dismiss your case. And that's really the way that we did most cases. But what we started to try to move more into was to be able to take cases even earlier than that, because we know that even the process of, you know, being arrested and charged and all of that is criminalizing, and there are harms. And if we can go before that, you know, and resolve a matter with restorative justice, that would be ideal. So we started off creating an off-ramp for people who are already being prosecuted. In DC, we have a very good diversion program. Tons of our cases are diverted. They're all low level. They're never prosecuted. We don't want to touch those. We want them to be diverted from the system. Our program was really set up for the young people who are going to be prosecuted. They were more serious cases and they were higher risk young people. And so we wanted to create another off-ramp from that system that would give them an opportunity to have their case dismissed. And we, you know, over time built up our program, and we were successful enough that the chief of the juvenile section, the person who oversaw the juvenile prosecutors, started to send us cases in a different way. They would say, look, these kids have been, they've committed a certain crime. Law enforcement has come to us and said, here's the affidavit. We have, will you sign off on it so we can execute the arrest? We call them pre-petition custody orders. It's basically like a bench warrant. They're asking for the right to be able to make the arrest. And what the chief of the juvenile section started to do was say, at that point, before the young person's been arrested, now we have all the video evidence and whatever, let's see if restorative justice can resolve the matter before the young people are even arrested. And we got, you know, and we continue to get very serious cases. We've had stabbing cases, we've had carjacking cases, we've had burglaries, all pre-petition custody order, which means these young people are not even arrested. And there are times where we try and do restorative justice and it doesn't work out, meaning like both parties are not interested. And then the case, then the prosecutors will sign off on the custody order, the officers will go make the arrest and they'll prosecute them through the regular process. But this just kind of creates an opportunity before the young person is pulled into the system, even at the point of arrest, to try and not divert, but send the case to resolution through a different manner. What we do with restorative justice when we get a case is our facilitators have, we have a confidentiality policy that is really derived from this code provision that allows for plea negotiations. There's a code provision in our city, and also I've heard elsewhere, that basically says that when folks are negotiating a plea, if the defendant admits guilt in the context of the plea negotiations, but then for whatever reason, the plea negotiations fall through and then you're going to continue to prosecute the case, whatever happened during that plea negotiation, that stays confidential. So there was already kind of the legal structure for that. And that was the basis of other victim offender mediation programs that had come before us and had been used in different iterations in DC. And so we use that same kind of code provision to create the confidentiality structure that we have that basically lets our restorative justice facilitators talk to everyone under a cone of confidentiality. So our facilitators will get a case, say it's not a pre-petition custody order, an early case, but a regular case where the prosecutor has gotten the case, prosecutor has already checked in with the victim, talked to the detective and says, you know what, this is the type of case that I'm gonna send to restorative justice. To answer Marin's question about patterns, we have some facilitators, like I said, who will send us all cases where people know each other. We have some facilitators who send us, you know, all cases except at the time gun cases. Like there are facilitators who just, I wouldn't say that there are patterns that we see, but what our facilitators will then do is they'll first go and speak to the person charged. And in order for us to speak to a respondent in DC, we have to first get permission from the defense attorney and then get permission from the parents. We typically do that at a status hearing where everyone is going to be showing up anyway. It's at the first status hearing. We'll talk to the defense attorney, then they'll introduce us to the parents, we'll talk to the parents, and then we have a chance to speak to the young person. This conversation is very important because this is where we gauge if the young person is willing and able to take responsibility for what happened and what they did. So in that first meeting, or maybe we'll meet with them, you know, in court, but then say, can our facilitators go to people's homes to meet with folks? So they'll say, oh, can I come to your home and talk to you at home? You know, court's a stressful place. They'll finally have a sit down meeting in person with them that's more lengthy. And then they'll say, I need you to tell me what happened. And they make sure that the young person is willing to do it and is going to, because there are sometimes, I had a case early on where this, you know, was a mistake that we all learned from, is I met with the young person, I met with their defense attorney and their parents. This is what it's going to take. You're going to have to take responsibility. You're going to have to speak to the victim. You know, it's going to be really tough, but you're going to have to do it. Yeah, that's fine. I'm going to do it. Parents are like, he's absolutely going to do it. You know, defense attorney's like, this makes a lot of sense. You know, you need to have your case dismissed. Young person said, yep, I can do it. No problem. Then I go, as facilitators do, and then speak to the person who's been harmed, to the victim of the crime. And that conversation will also happen in person, oftentimes in the person's home. And that's where we ask, like, what have you been through? How are you feeling? What do you need? And then over the course of building trust and rapport with that person who's been harmed, survivor or victim, we'll offer restorative justice when they, you know, when they feel comfortable and the other person feels comfortable. In that case, I went to the person who'd been harmed and spent a lot of time with that person, talked about what the justice process could offer, talked about what restorative justice might offer. And finally, this woman who is the victim of the crime was really like, this is what I need. I need to be able to talk to him. I need to be able to talk to his family. I want to hear from him. I have a bunch of questions. I need him to explain why he did this, etc. Blah, blah, blah. And then I go back to the young person, as you know, we do in the preparation process. You talk to folks multiple times, go back to the young person and I say, okay, well, these are the questions I'm going to ask you. How are you going to answer these questions? And I said, now talk about what happened. And he was like, oh, I didn't do it. It was like my friend or something like that. And I was like, oh no, because then I'm in this like really tough position where I have to go back to the victim of the crime, tell her restorative justice is no longer available to her and not be able to explain why. Because everything that the young person said is confidential and can never be repeated without his permission. And this person has like emotionally kind of psychologically gotten ready for what restorative justice has to offer. And now it's kind of been pulled away. And so that was like a real hard lesson to learn. So our facilitators are, you know, doing the hard work of like, and it's really like kind of labor intensive work of going and talking to people multiple times. And then you have to find out what supporters they want. You have to speak to the supporters and bring schedule and bring everyone together. The type of cases, Marin, that really are red flags are where you have victims of crime who are really really punitive, or you have respondents who are unable to admit what they've done, or kind of are really kind of stuck in a space of victim blaming or minimizing their behavior. I have to say that with young people, there is always a little bit of kind of like defensiveness and that. And we know we can work with young people quite a bit, especially because part of the process is building their capacity to understand that they've harmed somebody. And so we go through a lot of like, all right, well, let's think about if this was your mom who was hurt and you were sitting in a conference as that person's supporter, and then the person said that to you, how would you feel? How would you want them to look at you? What kind of eye contact would you want them to show your mom? That kind of thing. And so they start to build capacity to show empathy in the way. So like a little bit here and there is fine. And a lot of teenagers are monosyllabic, and you have to really like spend time and build trust to get them to be able to open up and be verbal and all of that. But there are some folks who are just are really not appropriate for restorative justice on both sides. And so those are the red flags that we look for. And frankly, I have to say, like, I always feel like victims are given such little agency in the typical criminal justice process that I feel like even us just offering an option to a person that's been harmed, even if they say no, I feel like that's a little bit of a victory too, because they've had the power and agency to say, you know what, I have these two choices, I'm going to choose one over another. And that's control in a situation where they've lost a lot of control, and that's fine. And so we are very deferential to victims and what they want. Although there are a lot of victims who in the first meeting, they're like, absolutely not, I would never do this, absolutely not. And then our facilitators are really fantastic about being like, that's fine, that's great. How about I check in with you in a week? I just want to check to see that you're doing okay. I remember you told me your son wasn't sleeping well because he was worried. I just want to check in about that. And they do. And over time, folks sometimes like have more questions, have more interest, and then they come around. We've had many, many victims who've come around over time and participated and had very successful conferences. So what I needed to do was to get money and positions, FTEs, full-time employees, to do this work in the office. But like I said, I had a boss's boss who was really supportive of innovation. And so one thing that I did is we had a vacancy in our victim services division that, the caseloads had been going down, and they really just didn't, I could make the case that they didn't need to fill that position, and I had them convert it into a restorative justice position. I applied for a DOJ grant under the Smart Prosecution federal DOJ grant program and got 2 facilitators paid for through that grant. And then we, you know what I did? This was the secret sauce. I invited the staffer, like the key staffer of our city council's judiciary committee, to sit in and observe a restorative justice conference. And she became a huge believer. And so every year since then, she's given us a new position. And she's just like such a huge advocate of restorative justice. And I think that's it seems like a sneaky thing, but building support and buy-in by bringing people along and having them experience restorative justice has been like the key to getting folks to open doors, because there's money out there, right? Like there's money, there are positions. If this is a priority, people will make it something that happens. And her boss was the council member from a particular ward. We had a burglary case in that ward with 3 constituents of theirs who agreed to do restorative justice, and a young person who had burglarized their home and actually burglarized another couple of homes as well. And it was like a really powerful experience, and it changed everything for this city council staffer, who's now given us tons of positions and money. So we're really grateful, but I think that's part of it. I believe in terms of budgeting that while grants are good for like starting things up, I think grants are vulnerable. I worked in philanthropy, and I know that nonprofits are just very vulnerable to the cycles and whims of philanthropy. And I worry about programs that are completely dependent on year-to-year grant making. I think the nice thing about government, you know, is that when you build it, it sticks around. And we were looking to institutionalize something, and having a line item in a budget or a position that's dedicated to the work, it shows commitment to the work, and that also is really hard to dismantle over time. And so I would suggest that you should use whatever resources you can get from grant funding, but the real goal, like the victory, is when you get government dollars. Statistics. So yeah, the juvenile justice system has really terrible recidivism outcome statistics, Michael. So like the bar is super low. That's kind of convenient for us. So a 15% reduction in recidivism isn't bad compared to, you know, what exists, which is about 60% of recidivism in the juvenile justice system nationally. At least DC has such bad statistics that it's hard for us to be clear about what our recidivism rate is. The 7 cases that went back, like Maren said, they are very few, but those cases, a couple of them were cases where the conference kind of fell apart. In one, there were kind of 2 families that had known each other for a long time, and one of the families just lost it during the conference and stormed out. Another case was, and a few of the cases where the young people didn't complete the terms of their agreement. Typically, our facilitators work really closely with these young people so that they are able to complete the terms of their agreement. That's one thing. The second thing is, when we write the terms of the agreement is a consensus document. And we spend a lot of time with the young people in advance saying, like, you have the power to say no. Like, let's practice. If the victim of this crime says, I want you to do, you know, this huge thing, like, what does that look like to you? And what are you going to say if you don't want to do that and you want to do something else? How are you going to do that? And so we try to empower, especially if we think there's going to be, sometimes we can anticipate like a racial power dynamic or a class power dynamic, or a young person who's very intimidated by authority, or a victim who's very like strong-minded and is going to be really demanding and thinks a lot is owed to them. So we'll anticipate those kind of potential biases and breakdowns, and then we'll work on compensating for them. And so in the conference, we'll make sure, like, are you sure you're able to do this? So we try and make the agreement be something that is achievable for the young person. And then we include, like, how are you going to accomplish this? Who needs to help you? And we write those things down. So, you know, okay, you're going to do this community service. Who's going to drive you there? Like, is your mom going to be able to do that? Who's going to, you know, call and make sure that you're allowed to come and all of that. So we try to make it as concrete as possible. There have been a couple of cases where the young person just completely didn't do it. Like, no, despite all of the work that we did to try and bring them along, they didn't do it. It's interesting, in one of those cases, the person who was the victim of the crime spoke on a panel for us and told the audience that this person didn't comply. It was a young person who'd been in and out of the justice system. One of the terms was that he was supposed to call and check in with the victim once a week. This victim was a police officer from an assault on a police officer case. The police officer was badly injured in a situation where he was trying to apprehend the young person, and he kind of fell badly and had his eye damaged pretty severely. And the police officer said, nonetheless, it was a really important process for him and his wife to have gone through. And he felt really enriched by the experience. And I remember him saying in this panel that he felt it was actually more important for his wife than for him, even for her to see the person who hurt him and not be scared of that, not be scared for him, because this was a person who had struggled a lot in his life. So, so yeah, sometimes young people don't complete. And then the process just it reverts back to the prosecutor and the regular prosecution. So in that case, the case was not dismissed and the young person went to sentencing and was given a probation term of some sort, or whatever the term of the sentence was supposed to be. And then finally, I want to address the like really kind of muddled thinking of my own that was demonstrated in all of your questions about like the risk of having a program in a prosecutor's office. I think, like I said, I think it's really important that you have, like I've talked to prosecutors' offices where the elected DA is not that reform-minded. Not really committed to the principles of restorative justice, but some leadership staff or management staff really is. And I'm just kind of like, I just don't think this is a good idea, because it takes a lot of fortitude to make sure that you don't fall into the danger that I was trying to get at. Like, we have prosecutors and judges who love our program, who want every young person to go through restorative justice. And they are inclined to send us cases that they would otherwise not prosecute. Sometimes because they have a victim who's really interested in doing it, or because they think the kid could really use it, or they're really like, well-intentioned and want this young person to have this experience. But what that ends up looking like is net widening. So we have to have really tough conversations with our prosecutors and their leaders. And sometimes it's the leadership of the prosecution group, folks who are really on board and we see eye to eye, and they'll tell us, they'll make the phone call to me or to my facilitator, which is, it's hard to say no to the boss, but be like, oh, I think this would be great for this case. I think it'd be really good. And then when I talk to the line prosecutor, I'm like, would you really take this case to trial? Would you really prosecute this kid and take this to trial? And they're like, well, I mean, I have legal sufficiency, right? Like, I've got all the elements. I have the legal right to take it to trial. And I'm like, no, but would you take this to trial? They'd be like, no, I probably wouldn't. And then we have to say, no, we're not going to take the case, because that would be now exposing somebody who would otherwise, we have to say, if restorative justice didn't exist in this office, if we just didn't have that option, would you divert this case or would you prosecute? And a lot of times they'd be like, I'd probably divert it. I wouldn't put the victim through a trial. My victim wouldn't be good on the stand, like some deficiencies in the evidence sometimes that the young person could use the diversion program. And so that's a really tough line to like hold. And so you need to be vigilant about net widening. Another thing is that it's funny, sometimes the US attorneys, the federal prosecutors will call us, and I've recently got a call from a prosecutor who doesn't believe in restorative justice, but the victim kind of is asking to speak to the person who committed the crime. And so in their mind, they're kind of like, and I've heard this from prosecutors before, like, I'm not sure that this actually works to change criminals or respondents, but it's good for the victim. So I'm gonna prosecute the kid, and I'm going to do this for the victim. Restorative justice for the victim, prosecution for the kid. Like, that's my balance, like, because they want it all. And for us, it's really important that this restorative justice program operates as an off-ramp. It has to be incentivized. So we have to say, you have to be willing to dismiss this case. Not that it's just a condition of the plea or that it's a part of probation. Like, we don't do any of that. Like, if you want to do restorative justice, you're going to dismiss the case at the end of it. Now, sometimes they take a plea first. They take the plea, and then if they're successful in the courtroom, what they'll do is the defense attorney will move to withdraw the plea, and the government will dismiss the case. But the case will be dismissed. The charge will be dismissed, and that's, again, a really tough thing to maintain with prosecutors, some of whom are really well-intentioned. And then I think also some folks believe, I feel a little bit less worried about this, but some folks believe that the restorative justice concept is one that came from community, and it belongs in community, right? This process has its origins in Native culture in America, and indigenous culture in the Maori in New Zealand, in West Africa. Like, this comes from communities who didn't have justice systems because those systems hurt people, and this healed people. And so when you take it out of community and you put it in the system, you are corrupting the very concept of restorative justice. And there is something to that. And that's why it was super important for me when we started restorative justice that we hired people who young people and their families who are being charged with crimes could really relate to. In fact, it's gotten to a point where I don't take cases anymore because it's funny, when I first started the program and I was able to hire 3 or 4 facilitators, I'd done a billion interviews and I ended up with 4 top candidates and they were all men. And I called Sujata Baliga in Oakland, who was like kind of a giant in restorative justice, one of the kind of modern leaders of the movement. And I said, is this a problem? And she said, yeah, it's a problem because you're gonna have some participants who are girls or women. And when you do restorative justice, it creates this opportunity for trauma to come out. Sometimes trauma is triggered, you know, in the event or in the conversation, and trauma may come out. And if you have a young person, a girl, or even a woman adult who has experienced sexual trauma herself in her life, she's not going to feel comfortable discussing it with a guy. You just need a female to be able to be there for her to discuss that with. And so I was like, oh, good call, right? So I, you know, went back and changed who I put as my top candidates, and we have a balance of men and women as our facilitators. But similarly, like most of the young people who come through the system have experienced they've experienced oppression, racial oppression. They've experienced, you know, systemic racism. There's the whole legacy of white supremacy in our country has, you know, had implications on their lives. And so I feel like it's really important that we have Black facilitators who are there. So if those things come out, they can talk about them with them, because as well-intentioned as I can possibly be, like it's not clear that somebody's going to want to discuss that with me. And we need them to feel safe having those discussions. And I think that's part of why community seems like a better place for the restorative justice process. Obviously, I'm not so convinced of that because I run a program in a prosecutor's office. But I do think it's really important, not only that I say it, but that folks really grapple with the dangers of corrupting the process, corrupting the thing, and then also having it hurt communities more than help them when they are thinking about putting it in a prosecutor's office. And that's something I'm happy to continue to work with you all on if I can be helpful, and kind of be that voice in your head and remind you and like help you put together policies and procedures that try and account for those things and mitigate those risks. That's what we've tried to do. And I'm happy to share, Parisa, I share our policies and guidelines with other offices. I'm happy to share those. Let's see, it is 8:13, it's already late. Just the one other question I wanted to hit, I'm sorry if I've missed some of your questions, but the one I wanted to talk about was domestic violence, dating violence cases. We've never had an animal cruelty case, so I don't think I can speak to that. With respect to domestic violence cases, I had from the beginning taken a very conservative approach to those cases because in the restorative justice field and the domestic violence victim services field, there's like real concern about the two meeting. And so as our party line was no DV cases, no intimate partner DV cases at our office. Like, we're just not going to go. I don't know that we're trained on it. You know, there's all this potential for abusers to manipulate the forum. So we had basically said we weren't going to do that. And then what was crazy was we had an assistant chief of the juvenile section who came to us and said, we've got prosecutors who are prosecuting these low-level sexual harm cases, and they just don't feel like they should be prosecuting them. Would you guys consider taking these cases? And so I put my staff through healthy masculinity training. We did trainings with restorative justice folks who do sexual harm cases, and we took low-level sexual harm cases. And then one of our prosecutors, who is our sex prosecutor, who, you know, has done that for years, she came to me with a case and said, she's like, I would never send you a sexual assault case, but I have a victim who really wants to talk to the person who sexually assaulted her. And I was wondering if you would consider doing this case. And so it was actually two white young people, and I facilitated that case several months ago. And I had a restorative justice practitioner who handles sexual assault cases coach me through every step of the way. And it was a really emotional and tough conference, and it was really, really successful. That was it was a good experience. The young woman had been experiencing depression. She hadn't been sleeping. She'd gone through such difficulties since this had happened to her many, many months before that. And then I've checked in with her recently. She's gotten off her antidepressants. She's been sleeping well. So she really has been able to move forward. It's not that the thing didn't happen. Her life has changed and she's not completely healed, but she's definitely moving forward. And that was really gratifying. And interestingly, I got a call from the executive director of NVR DC, which is our victim rights organization in DC, just a couple of days ago. And she said, I really think that we need to be able to take more, you guys need to take more sexual assault cases, in part because what they're seeing in DC is a significant decrease in reporting of sexual assaults to law enforcement among women of color, African-American women in particular, since George Floyd and the protests, and that they've seen this drop. And it's not that the assaults are changing, because they meet with people in the hospital. So the number of cases are the same, but the willingness to report crime has gone down. And she says that she talks to victims a lot and really feels like restorative justice as an option is something that should be offered, because I was shocked to hear her say this. She thinks it's really patronizing to assume that victims can't handle restorative justice when they are the victims of sexual and domestic violence. But we have not built out a capacity to do that extensively. All right, I've talked so long.
You have. I wonder, there's one question that Parissa put in the chat that I think is a question that comes up. It comes up on the school side as well. Maybe you can answer it real quick and then we'll go to break and come back. And that is there any concern about excluding young people who are differently abled or on the spectrum?
It's a great question. When we were trained by Tariq Maserani, who runs Restorative DC, he also works for an organization that deals with young people who have learning disabilities and special needs in schools. And he specifically did a training for us about working with those young people. His position has been, and so our position has always been, that there are very, very, very few young people who are not able, despite their disabilities, to participate in restorative justice, to be able to take responsibility for doing something wrong, are able to, show empathy and all of those things. What he had suggested during our training was, and I think we've done it on one occasion, is sometimes if the young person really struggles to communicate effectively, or feels like, or the facilitator feels like won't be received in the right way, is to ask for a special education advocate or somebody who has worked with the young person, a therapist or somebody, to be there in the conference with them to help speak a little bit about the challenges that the young person experiences, and then be able to shepherd the child through the process and translate if that's necessary.
Okay. All right. Well, this is so wonderful, Seema. And we're going to take you up. I made a note about your office's policies and procedures, so we'll follow up about that. And yeah, I think we may have some follow-up questions too, that if people shoot them to me, I can send them to you and see if there's anything, little details like that. But thank you so much. This has been really great and really informative. You've covered a lot of ground, and congratulations on having this program up and going. I mean, despite whatever misgivings or whatever, you've got something that's really working and helping young people a lot, and victims a lot, and so that's great. So we're gonna take a 10-minute break. I'm gonna suggest everybody unmute yourselves if you want to say thank you to Seema. You don't have to stay till 9 o'clock. You're welcome to, I think, but I can imagine you're ready for not being on Zoom. So So we just want to thank you very much for
Yeah.
joining us.
Thank you all, you guys.
Okay,
Great
thank you.
questions, and
Thank
please
you.
call on me if we can be helpful at all.
Sure.
Thank you, Seema.
Thank
You're
you.
very welcome.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Okay, bye.
Yeah.
What is 8:20 now? So I'm gonna, well, let me hit stop the recording, and we're gonna take an actual break.